Nelson Mandela, when he passed away, there was a lot of tributes that poured in, Doctor, as I said earlier on. And one statement that was made really, stuck in my mind, and that was, Nelson Mandela does not belong to us now, he belongs to the ages. How would Nelson Mandela's legacy carry on from here, especially in South Africa, which has come out of this struggle? I asked this question from the South African ambassador to Sri Lanka as well when I met him on the day after.
He's an
Nelson
ANC
Mandela's
man, very distinguished
yes.
man, former
And I
minister,
asked him this exact question, Doctor, but with your political experience and your knowledge, how do you think South Africa is going to progress from here on with the legacy of Nelson Mandela?
Well, I think that South Africa has been put on the right road by Mandela, and that's very clear. But South Africa can now see, from the universality of the acclaim, the applause, the endorsement of its own greatest son, Mandela, what the world expects. It now has a high bar. It has an example. Not that South Africa needed a reminder, but now it has seen the prestige that has accrued to South Africa itself because of Mandela. And therefore, this week is bound to have an effect on how South Africans see themselves and their duty. They will, I believe, try to live up to the ideals and the example of Nelson Mandela. And already young people are conscious of Mandela. They will become more conscious as this week ends. And I do believe that what Mandela has done for South Africa, for the ANC and for the rest of the world is indelible. He has in fact now been added on to the ages, just as Mahatma Gandhi has. So his example will not be forgotten. It will continue to inspire people somewhere, because President Barack Obama said that he cannot imagine his life without the example.
He was one of many. He was one of many. There were several world leaders and even politicians in Sri Lanka who said, Nelson Mandela had influenced them a lot in their political lives.
Really? Sri Lanka?
Yes, there was. And Sri Lanka and South Africa have had very strong ties. And even this was brought up when tributes flowed in for Nelson Mandela. And I remember recently when the Chogam was held in Sri Lanka and when these allegations were leveled and Sri Lanka was in the spotlight, many of Sri Lanka's diplomats and parliamentarians said, look here, we have the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, which is something like the NTC of South Africa. Do you see similarities between the NTC and the LLRC?
Well, the Sri Lankan and South African situations were quite different, and to the extent that there are similarities, they have not been recognized. Now, what is similar is this, and this you do not find acknowledged on the part of the human rights organizations, which is that the South African struggle was for majority rule. Now, it is true that that majority was not defined in terms of skin color, but it was a struggle against minority rule and for majority rule. And Sri Lanka, insofar as it is a practicing, albeit flawed democracy, does have majority rule, which is degenerated into a kind of majoritarianism. But we do have majority rule. And in that sense, the fight against the Tigers was a fight for the extension of majority rule, democratic majority rule, to the whole of the island, and against the kind of a minority domination under the jackboot of the LTT in the north. South Africa, the new South Africa, also refused to officially call itself a federal system. It is not a classic unitary state, but it remains silent on the issue of whether it should be unitary or federal, which is similar to the situation we had with the Solberry Constitution of 1947. It is not our situation today, but it is perhaps something that a future generation of Sri Lankan politicians could look at, where instead of defining oneself in one way or the other, you remain neutral or agnostic or silent on whether it is unitary or federal. Now, The Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa was the result of two things. One, a negotiated settlement, which we did not have, because the Tigers were never sincere about negotiations. There were many attempts. They murdered all the leaders who talked to them. They even murdered their own negotiator, Mahathir. So, we cannot adopt the model of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was the byproduct of a peaceful negotiated transition. We had to fight a war, and we won that war. That outcome, that result, cannot yield a Truth and Reconciliation process along South African lines. That's point one. Point two, as I said, the South African struggle was one of transition from minority rule to majority rule. And we already have majority rule. So, what happened in the TRC in South Africa was that the white minority, which had exercised a brutal and undemocratic domination for a century over the black majority, then came before the commission and said, look, we admit we did these crimes which were wrong. Now, you cannot expect a democratically elected government which represents the majority, as in Sri Lanka, and an armed force which is set up by the legitimate democratic state to behave like the deposed, illegal, illegitimate white minority dictatorship of South Africa. So I don't think there is any real relevance of the TRC process of South Africa to Sri Lanka, to the extent that you can adapt and adopt some of this. I think it is contained entirely and exclusively within the framework of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission of Sri Lanka, which has said, and we have said this before, that there are specific and credible allegations of crimes committed by the Sri Lankan state. They're not general, they're not 40,000, they're not war crimes, but there are certainly specific incidents which have been listed, and the LLRC asks for an independent investigation, including into the allegations contained in the Channel 4 movies, the earlier ones. Now that, I believe, is the right way to go. So my short answer would be LLRC yes, TRC no. But there is a major lesson that we have to learn from South Africa, and that is not linked to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's quite independent of it, and that is political reconciliation, political dialogue at the leadership level. If you don't have, what if Nelson Mandela said, look, I don't want to talk to this guy de Klerk. What if de Klerk said, no, I don't want to talk to Mandela? They realized that each of them represented their constituencies, their people, and they couldn't pass the buck. Mandela didn't say, look, go talk to a parliamentary select committee. De Klerk didn't say, no, I'm not going to come for your cabinet meeting. I'm not going to participate in the district development council meeting unless you remove your governor. So in Sri Lanka there is a deadlock, and there is a deadlock at the level of the leadership. On the one hand, Justice Vigdeshwaran, the Chief Minister, and Mr. Sambandhan, and on the other hand, President Rajapaksa. There's a gap, there's a gulf. Now the lesson of South Africa is, never mind all the reasons. Never mind who did what to whom. Never mind the issue of accountability. That's not a precondition. You talk to each other. If Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk could clasp hands and hold them up high, despite the century of enmity between what they represent, why can't that happen in Sri Lanka? You don't even need holding hands up high, but you do need to be able to sit and talk.
And some form of cooperation between the two.
Absolutely. Political dialogue, a process of political dialogue, a process of conversation. The example has to come from the top. That is the top of the government, the Sri Lankan state, and the the Tamil democratic leadership.
Well, Doctor, we spoke about the lessons that we can learn from South Africa. I would like to go into foreign policy now. That has been a widely debated topic in Parliament. We saw last week where opposition parliamentarians came out very strongly about the foreign policy in Sri Lanka, saying that it fell short of being, in with the times. For example,
What foreign policy? But anyway,
we can question that. United National Party parliamentarian Sajid Premadasa and Sujiva Senasinghe were very vocal in their objection about Sri Lanka's foreign policy. Sujiva Senasinghe saying that Sri Lanka is acting in a way that, as a country that has something to hide, and when it really does not have anything to hide, and that after the end of the war, Sri Lanka should have come out more openly about things that happened without having to play this role of hiding. And it says that because of certain weaknesses in the foreign policy, it was the people, the normal people in Sri Lanka, who are going to be the most affected.
yes,
You agree with that, Doctor?
I agree completely, because if we lose the vote in Geneva in March 2014, there will be consequences. It won't be like 2012 or 2013. Prime Minister Cameron is spearheading this time. And the Americans will support it, because Britain and America are the closest of friends in the world. The result will be, in the first instance, now I know people are talking about sanctions, even the opposition is talking about sanctions, but there's something that everybody has forgotten, and that's the impact on the markets. Before anyone gets around to sanctions, if they ever get around to sanctions, there's going to be a signal that goes out to the markets, and the markets respond immediately. And nobody's thinking about that. That's going to affect our economy. It's going to affect the living standards of our people. It's going to affect capital flows. It's going to affect whether people shift money out of this place or whether they bring it in. And that affects jobs. So it's not something that you should that anybody should take lightly. Now, the next step, of course, as we have discussed, would be legal and also economic, an economic squeeze. There are those who say that it will come sooner. I think it will take a little time.